Do modifications really make a difference? In this video, we take this Prodigy and upgrade it to a competitive pedigree. If you'd watched my 1500 round count review on the Prodigy, I felt strongly that this particular platform had enough good bones in it. If you put a little bit of elbow grease and some upgrades into it, that it could be competitive for a fraction of the cost which you get on this platform. Now this is a 5-inch Prodigy, and I gathered a list of items I actually ended up wanting to do to this. I was gonna make this a collaboration with my good friend Marcelo, who is the CZ armorer and has a good hand and eye for actually doing good things to gun to get him competitive. Well, long story short, in our talks, this ended up becoming his gun. And so he decided that he was going to make it a full-on limited optics build, and this is what we ended up targeting with this gun. So let's take a closer look at the actual parts that were installed in this gun. To start this off, we want to actually talk about what this cost to make to get it to this point. So that total came out to $1,835. And that includes everything that we did to get it ready for limited optics, with the exception of the optic itself. Now, the reason why I'm not including the optic in this discussion is because that is a choice that you can pick in between guns. And for the purpose of what we're doing here, we want to see what the actual mechanical advantages are with doing these upgrades. If you're curious about all the parts we ended up using for this build, I'll leave a link in the description to my website, and you can see the full parts list and check that out. At the total build price that we landed at, it's still a tremendous value, considering that if you were to add additional things like change up the safety or the nitro fin, those are things you would probably do to like your staccato or even maybe a bull armory if you get one of those. So the value of this thing is still well in line with what you end up getting. Now, the one thing we'll start off with is talking about the trigger. Keep in mind, it's everything inside internally that gets it to the point that it ends up being competitive. So let's start with touching on the parts. For this build, we used an EGW ignition kit, and that includes the sear, disconnector, hammer, and sear spring. And for the actual trigger itself, we went with an Atlas setup with both the trigger bow and the shoe itself coming from Atlas. Okay, so what did that trigger pull end up coming out to? Okay, so we're gonna measure it right here with the scale. And you'll see here, we're just about 2 3/4 there on the poundage, which sounds right for this setup. And that's good because, you know, now you have room that you can tune this and play with. And so now that we've got that nice pull, what's the trigger characteristic like over the stock Prodigy? Well, in this case, it's just a little bit of pre-travel and a very firm wall, and just a touch of pressure breaks. There's actually no creep, and I noticed that particularly with the factory trigger in this, that there was a little bit of creep. And so when you go to reset this, did you see that? It's so minimal. And that's the great thing about when you start to get into these nicer trigger groups, is that particularly with this bow and shoe setup, that you can adjust the over travel so that way you get such a short reset. So let's talk about the other part of this equation, the ergonomics of this. Well, in this case, since Marcelo wanted to go with the limited optics build, there are a couple things that he ended up going with. One being a nitro fin, which is a suitable thumb rest. A large part of that for me is making that a strong index point, and I think that really showed up in the results when I go over them later, and how I was able to consistently grab the gun the same way every time. And you'll see that we went with a single-sided Wilson Combat safety here, which is a little bit wider than the factory, and that's great because that gives you more purchasing points right there to really hunker down on that. And the other component of this is the EGW magwell. The other thing on top of making the reloads easier is that it actually pushes your hand higher up into the grip tame naturally. So you get a firm lock into that much easier. And the one thing that was added too was this extended mag release from Dawson Precision. And that makes it convenient too when you're just pulling it in. It's just a nice touch right here. Whereas before you had to kind of reach and pull around. When you reduce the variables in movement, this reduces the likelihood of a mistake happening. And so a lot of times people can kind of be nitpicky on how these parts may on paper be marginal, but they end up being multiplied when you actually look at your results. Now, I want to talk about this from an IDPA standpoint because I know I'll get a question about it. So I'll just grab my box here and I'll try to set it in here. And as you can see, it's definitely a challenge. Okay, so I did manage to sneak it in there this time, but here's where it's actually illegal is on this part where this whole rear section is hanging up, and that has everything to do with this mag well. So if you go with this mag well, know that for IDPA purposes, this is actually too wide and it's too long, thus pushing the gun up in the box. Now additionally, you would have to consider removing this nitrofin and running the factory slide stop if you wanted to go that route. When we tally up everything here, I ended up buying this Prodigy brand new last year for $1,300 retail, and you add about $535 worth of parts, and if you remember, less the optic, and this gets you this point. And in case you're wondering, as of today, this particular Holosun, which is a 507 comp, which is nice and big, as you can see there, this is on Optics Planet right now for $370. But that right there, guys, is the only thing that would be different that would complete the setup for limited optics. All right, now, so we're going to get into the actual test of shooting this gun and see if it actually measures up. Now, before I do that, this particular video, because it does have modified internals, I cannot monetize this video. However, what would really help me a lot is if you like this video, hit that like button, and you definitely want to subscribe because I will have more content out in the future on various things. So that would definitely help me a lot. I ended up choosing one simple test, and that was a 25-yard bill drill. Now, the conditions are that we start from a barrel and also that we use the same ammo, which in this case is Blazer 115 aluminum. While we can discuss transition and other exercises, the true mechanical difference really comes with how well this gun performs at distance and speed. Now, speaking of human error, I'll be the one administering the test, and a little bit about me is I am currently a USPSA A-class in carry optic as well as an IDPA master. So I have a fair amount of time behind the gun and also something that extracts that particular exercise at its limits. Now, to really take a good solid sample of this, we did 7 scored bill drills. We took the best 4 and we ended up doing an average of the time and the points. If you're not familiar with how we're scoring, we're using a USPSA target and we're going to use hit factor scoring. So that simply means that we're going to take the points that we got in the scoring zones and divide it by the time. The higher the hit factor, the better the result. So this does test both the accuracy and the speed of what's going on here. When we did the baseline test in its stock configuration, I ended up having an average time of 3.958, with the best being 3.75. Now my average hits came out to about 26.5 points, which is, I'm averaging about 2 Charlies, and that gave it a total hit factor of 6.695. Now to get those really good runs and hits, I actually had to work up to that because my regular competition gun is a much lighter setup and I have more time behind that, whereas the Prodigy is definitely starting from ground zero for me, so I had to get used to it. Now, when we fast forward it now, we add in the modifications. So now that we've done the trigger job and everything else, that average time dropped to 3.723, with the best being 3.70. My average hits did improve to 28, meaning I'm averaging 1 Charlie. So that brings it to an average hit factor of 7.521. Now, when you really think about that, apples to apples, we're already ahead here by nearly almost a full point on the hit factor scale. But where this can be eye-opening is when you start to think that you're going to have to shoot at least 4 different arrays, right? Assuming that you draw and run exactly the same, there's literally about a second difference when you take the average time and add it up over 4 arrays. So to keep it short, yes, this does give you an advantage. And what was interesting is my best runs were my first 2. And that had more to do with the fact that, number one, I was relaxed when I was ready to shoot, especially at distance. Having relaxed shoulders really pays off. And I found out the harder I pushed this gun, it ended up just going backwards in both time and points. So I wasn't really winning pushing it hard, and I made adjustments throughout this until I got to my 7th score. Now, with the 4 best scores I ended up tallying up, those ended up being 0.05 difference in raw time. That is amazing, and that's a testament to how consistent this setup is. Between grabbing the gun and consistent trigger pulls and sights, that's what gets me to a point where this gun is deadly consistent. To kind of piggyback on that, the stock configuration variance was 0.38, so a massive difference in variance. And in the game of USPSA or any competition, consistency does win. One thing I did notice is I felt that I could do a little bit better on time, and I felt that the spring on it was just a tad too light for the Blazer 115 I was putting through it. So I reached out to Marcel to see if he did something different with the recoil springs, and he did. He ended up tuning it for 147 ammo, and I happened to have enough ammo to do 2 runs. In those runs, my average time was 3.35 seconds, with my best at 3.34. Now I know that's only 2 guys, but here's the thing. With that, the times were 3.34 and the other one 3.36. And my average hits were 27 points, and so that brought it to an average hit factor of 8.060. Now when you add ammo matched to the gun, this really just takes this to the next level. So there is something to said about getting your ammo and tuning your gun to your load. So let's go back to the original question. Do modifications really make a difference? That question, particularly with this gun, is a resounding yes. Now, obviously we can play around with it and have more fun with it, but guys, I just want to give you a baseline if you're thinking, well, what would my actual improvement be if I upgraded this, this, and that? Well, particularly with this case, there was a good jump. And so guys, get out there, experiment with things, have fun. Until next time, we will see you at the range.